Rain drummed softly against the church windows as mourners gathered to say goodbye to a man whose quiet strength had held an entire family together. Tears mixed with whispered condolences, but beneath the sorrow lingered another emotion: anticipation. Everyone knew the reading of the will would decide the future of everything he had spent a lifetime building. Inside the lawyer's office, silence settled over the room. The stepmother sat with calm confidence, her elegant smile barely hidden. When the lawyer unfolded the final document, each sentence seemed to reward exactly what she expected. The grand estate became hers. The luxury vehicles, healthy bank accounts, and acres of rich farmland were transferred into her name. Every valuable possession belonged to her now. Then came the daughter's inheritance. The lawyer paused before quietly announcing that she would receive only the old barn standing alone at the far edge of the property. A stunned silence filled the room. Some lowered their heads in sympathy. Others exchanged confused glances, convinced her father had made a terrible mistake. The weathered barn had been abandoned for years, its faded boards barely standing against the wind. It held no livestock, no machinery, and certainly no value anyone could imagine. The stepmother struggled to hide the satisfaction spreading across her face. She believed the battle had ended exactly as she had planned. The daughter had received nothing worth fighting for. But the lawyer wasn't finished. "There is one final instruction," he said, unfolding a smaller handwritten note left by her father alone. The daughter's trembling hands accepted it. Only one sentence was written across the yellowed paper: "Never sell the barn, no matter what anyone offers." She read the words twice, unable to understand their meaning. Outside, thunder rolled across the dark sky. Far beyond the mansion, the lonely barn stood waiting beneath the storm, guarding a secret no one else even suspected still existed. By sunset, the daughter stood outside the front door of the only home she had ever known, holding a single worn suitcase. The stepmother watched from the porch without a trace of sympathy, her expression colder than the evening wind. There were no heartfelt goodbyes, no promises to stay in touch. The locks would be changed before morning. With nowhere else to go, she walked across the overgrown field toward the forgotten barn her father had left behind. Each step carried her farther from the warmth of her childhood and closer to a future she could neither imagine nor escape. The old structure groaned as she pushed the heavy wooden doors open. Dust floated through narrow beams of fading sunlight. Broken windows allowed the chilly breeze to whistle inside, while the roof leaked steadily into rusted buckets left behind years earlier. There was no electricity, no running water, and barely enough dry space to unroll an old blanket for the night. She sat quietly in the darkness, listening to the rain tap against the worn roof. Memories flooded back without warning. As a little girl, she had followed her father into this very barn, laughing as they fed horses, repaired fences, and shared stories while storms raged outside. Back then, the place had felt alive. Now it echoed with silence and loss. Across the property, lights glowed brightly inside the grand house. Expensive cars disappeared one after another as buyers arrived. Farm equipment, antiques, and treasured family heirlooms were loaded onto trailers before the week had ended. The stepmother celebrated each sale with satisfaction, convinced she was turning every memory into profit. From the doorway of the crumbling barn, the daughter watched strangers carry away pieces of her family's history. She owned almost nothing now except the building everyone believed was worthless. Yet every time she remembered her father's final message, one question refused to leave her mind. Why had he wanted her to protect this forgotten place at all costs? Morning light spilled through the broken windows as she gathered a hammer, a handful of old nails, and whatever scraps of wood she could salvage. If the barn was all she had left, she refused to let it collapse. Every repair felt like a quiet promise to the father she still missed. Hours passed beneath the summer heat. As she replaced loose planks near the center of the floor, her hammer struck one board with a deep, hollow thud. She stopped immediately. The sound was different. She tapped the surrounding boards one by one. Most answered with the solid knock of old timber, but the same strange echo returned from a small square near the middle of the barn. Kneeling closer, she brushed away years of dust, wondering what could possibly lie beneath. Before lifting the boards, something else caught her eye. The thick support beams were marked with faded initials carved long ago. Some belonged to her father, but others were unfamiliar, their edges softened by decades of age. They looked less like childish carvings and more like signatures left by people who wanted history to remember they had been there. Curiosity pushed her forward. She carefully loosened several weathered boards. Hidden beneath them were heavy iron rings fastened securely into old stone, far too strong to have held ordinary farm equipment. Their purpose made no sense, and their existence raised even more questions than answers. Searching the nearby shelves for clues, she opened a cracked wooden box coated in dust. Inside rested a faded photograph curled with age. Her breath caught. The picture showed her father standing proudly inside this very barn, years younger than she remembered. Beside him stood several unfamiliar men whose serious expressions suggested they shared something far more important than friendship. She turned the photograph over, hoping for names or a date. The back was blank. As the afternoon wind whispered through the cracked walls, one unsettling truth became impossible to ignore. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure this barn, and whatever it concealed, survived untouched for generations. Sleep refused to come that night. The photograph lay beside her blanket, and every unanswered question echoed louder than the rain striking the roof. At sunrise, she returned to the place where the picture had been hidden, convinced her father would never have left behind only a single clue. She searched every shelf, every beam, and every forgotten corner until her fingers brushed against a loose wall panel tucked behind a stack of rotting crates. The wood shifted with surprising ease. Holding her breath, she pulled it away. Inside the narrow space rested a small leather-bound journal wrapped in faded cloth. Her heart pounded as she carefully opened it. The first pages belonged unmistakably to her father. His familiar handwriting filled the paper with observations, dates, and rough sketches of the barn. Folded between several entries were hand-drawn maps marked with circles, arrows, and measurements that seemed to point toward different parts of the property. Strange symbols appeared in the margins beside drawings she couldn't understand. Then the tone suddenly changed. The careful notes became hurried. The writing grew uneven. One sentence had been pressed so deeply into the paper that it nearly tore through. Trust no one. Several pages later came another warning that chilled her even more. If you're reading this, they've already betrayed us. She stared at the words, reading them again and again. Betrayed by whom? What secret had forced her father to write as though danger surrounded him? Desperate for answers, she turned another page. It had been ripped out. Then another. And another. Nearly a third of the journal was gone. The torn edges had yellowed with age, proving the pages had disappeared years before her father died. Someone hadn't simply hidden this journal. Someone had carefully removed the most important part of its story. As she closed the cover, a cold breeze slipped through the cracks in the barn, carrying the uneasy feeling that whoever had erased those pages might still be watching, waiting to learn whether anyone had finally uncovered what was never supposed to be found. The journal never left her side after that discovery. Every warning her father had written lingered in her mind, making the quiet barn feel less like a shelter and more like the center of a mystery that refused to stay buried. 2 days later, a sleek black SUV rolled slowly across the dusty lane and stopped outside the barn. A sharply dressed businessman stepped out, smiling with practiced confidence. He barely glanced at the land before making an offer that left her speechless. He was willing to pay several times more than the barn could possibly be worth, and he insisted the deal could be completed that very day. She remembered the note. Never sell the barn, no matter what anyone offers. She politely refused. His smile faded for only a moment before he handed her a business card and quietly said, "If you change your mind, call me before someone else does." By evening, the stepmother arrived in a fury. She accused her of being foolish, insisting the old building was nothing but rotten wood and wasted land. "Take the money," she snapped. "You'll never see an offer like that again." The pressure felt strangely desperate, as though selling the barn mattered far more than anyone admitted. Soon, elderly neighbors began stopping by. They spoke in cautious voices about trucks arriving decades earlier under the cover of darkness, unfamiliar men working inside the barn, and whispered rumors that her father had protected something important after refusing to trust powerful people. That night, exhaustion finally overcame her. A sudden creak jolted her awake. Someone was inside. Moonlight revealed a shadow moving silently between the support beams, searching with careful hands. Before she could speak, the intruder slipped through the large doors and vanished into the darkness. She rushed outside, but only fresh footprints remained in the damp earth. For the first time, she understood that whatever was hidden inside the barn wasn't just valuable. It was important enough for strangers to risk everything to find it first. The footprints outside the barn disappeared with the morning dew, but they left behind a question too important to ignore. If strangers were searching for something, she needed to understand what her father had spent a lifetime protecting. She drove to the county archives where dusty shelves held decades of forgotten records. Hours passed as she sorted through old newspapers, land deeds, and fading property maps. At first, nothing seemed unusual, then a pattern began to emerge. Her grandfather's name appeared repeatedly during one of the region's hardest economic periods. While neighboring families were forced to sell their farms, he had somehow managed to keep every acre of land. Newspaper articles praised his determination, yet offered no explanation for how he had survived when so many others had lost everything. The deeper she searched, the stranger the story became. Several official property records had been removed entirely. Pages that should have documented ownership changes were simply missing, leaving empty spaces where history should have been. Even the county clerk admitted those files had disappeared long before anyone currently working there had been hired. Old employment records revealed another unsettling detail. Several men who had once worked on the family property had vanished within the same decade. No resignation letters, no forwarding addresses. Their names simply stopped appearing as though they had stepped out of history without a trace. The faded photograph from the barn suddenly carried a heavier meaning. Perhaps those unfamiliar faces weren't visitors at all. Perhaps they had been part of a secret that stretched back long before her father was born. As she left the archives, she noticed the stepmother's car parked across the street. The older woman wasn't looking inside the building. She was watching her. The confidence that once filled the stepmother's face had disappeared, replaced by restless eyes and trembling hands. For the first time, she looked frightened instead of victorious. Whatever had been hidden for generations was getting closer to the surface, and someone was becoming desperate to keep it buried. The days that followed felt like the ticking of an invisible clock. Every sunrise carried another reminder that time was slipping away, and every sunset brought the hidden secret one step closer to being lost forever. A large sign appeared at the entrance of the estate. The mansion had been sold. Within hours, contractors began surveying the property, marking fences with bright paint and driving stakes into the ground. Rumors spread quickly through the nearby town. A development company planned to clear much of the surrounding land and replace the old family estate with rows of expensive homes. Heavy machinery was scheduled to arrive within days. Standing outside the barn, she watched workers measuring the fields where she had once played as a child. Soon, bulldozers would tear through the landscape, erasing generations of memories beneath concrete and asphalt. For the first time, her father's warning carried terrifying urgency. If she failed to uncover the truth now, whatever had been hidden inside the barn could vanish forever. That evening, she reopened the journal, studying every page with fresh determination. Instead of reading the words, she examined the tiny details surrounding them. Strange symbols repeated beside certain entries, and several measurements matched those on the hand-drawn maps. Then she noticed something she had overlooked before. The first letter of several consecutive entries formed a deliberate sequence. It wasn't random. Carefully copying them onto a scrap of paper, she uncovered a short message her father had concealed in plain sight. "Follow the northern beam." Her pulse quickened. Lantern in hand, she hurried into the silent barn and searched until she found the oldest support beam facing north. Deep inside its weathered surface was another carving, almost invisible beneath layers of age and dust. It wasn't a name. It was an arrow. The arrow pointed toward the same section of floor where the hollow sound and iron rings had first caught her attention. As thunder rumbled across the evening sky, she realized the clues had never been scattered. Her father had been guiding her to one final destination all along. For 2 exhausting days she worked without stopping. Every loose board was lifted, every stone examined, and every inch of the barn measured against the maps in her father's journal. The arrow carved into the northern beam refused to leave her thoughts. It had to mean something. Late on the second evening, she fastened a rope to one of the iron rings embedded beneath the floor. With all her strength, she pulled. At first, nothing happened. Then came the grinding sound of ancient wood scraping against hidden stone. A section of the floor slowly shifted aside, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Cool, stale air drifted upward, carrying the unmistakable scent of earth sealed away for generations. Lantern trembling in her hand, she stepped carefully below. The underground chamber stretched farther than she had imagined. Thick stone walls surrounded a room untouched by sunlight for decades. Dust covered everything, yet nothing appeared disturbed. It was as though someone had locked the place and simply walked away, expecting it to remain forgotten forever. Along one wall stood several massive trunks reinforced with iron bands. Nearby rested rows of sealed wooden boxes marked with faded symbols matching those in the journal. She carefully opened one and discovered neatly preserved family documents tied together with worn ribbons. Another contained old ledgers, handwritten letters, and official papers bearing government seals from another era. Shelves at the far end displayed historical artifacts wrapped in cloth, their purpose still unclear but obviously valuable enough to protect with extraordinary care. Against the back wall sat 3 heavy chests secured with thick brass locks. Their surfaces were worn by time but otherwise untouched. As incredible as the discovery was, something else captured her attention. A solid wooden door stood alone beyond the chests. Unlike everything else, it was built into the stone itself and secured by a single black iron lock. There was no key. No handle on the outside. Only a small engraving carved into the center. She recognized the symbol immediately. It was the very same mark her father had drawn more times than any other in his hidden journal, and she knew whatever waited behind that final door was the secret he had sacrificed everything to protect. The symbol on the iron door matched the final page of the journal exactly. With shaking hands, she searched every trunk again until her fingers found a small brass key hidden inside the spine of an old leather ledger. It fit the lock perfectly. The door opened with a slow, echoing creak. Lantern light revealed a smaller chamber unlike anything she had imagined. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, each carefully organized. Waterproof cases protected stacks of legal documents, sealed maps, and handwritten agreements dating back generations. Every file had been preserved with remarkable care, as though her father had expected someone to discover them one day. She unfolded the first map. It showed the family's original property boundaries. They extended far beyond the current estate, covering thousands of acres that had gradually been claimed through fraudulent transfers over decades. Attached to the maps were court filings, notarized deeds, and government records proving the land had never been legally surrendered. The evidence was overwhelming. Nearby rested velvet-lined boxes containing priceless historical valuables entrusted to her grandfather during years of economic hardship. Rather than selling them for survival, he had secretly protected them until their rightful ownership could be proven. Then she found a locked metal case labeled in her father's handwriting. "For my daughters." Inside were several recording devices and carefully numbered storage tapes. She played the first recording. Her father's tired voice filled the silent chamber. He spoke of years spent uncovering forged signatures, hidden financial transactions, and deliberate deception carried out by the stepmother. Recording after recording captured conversations exposing her manipulation, her pressure to rewrite financial records, and her relentless attempts to isolate him from his own daughter while positioning herself to inherit everything. Finally came his last message. If you're hearing this, my plan worked. I couldn't trust anyone with these secrets. Had I left everything to you openly, they would have taken it before you ever had the chance to fight for it. They laughed at the barn because they believed it had no value. That's exactly what I wanted them to believe. The barn was never your inheritance, it was the key to it. Everything that truly belongs to you has always been waiting beneath your feet. Tears streamed down her face as years of confusion, rejection, and heartbreak suddenly made sense. Her father had never abandoned her. He had protected her in the only way he believed would keep the truth alive until she was finally strong enough to uncover it herself. The evidence hidden beneath the barn was too extensive to ignore. Within days, investigators filled the once-forgotten property, carefully cataloging every document, recording, map, and historical artifact. What had begun as a family dispute quickly grew into one of the largest fraud investigations the county had seen in decades. Experts verified the land records one by one. Forged signatures were exposed. Altered deeds were traced back through years of carefully planned deception. Every missing document from the public archives matched originals preserved inside the underground chamber, leaving little room for doubt. The stepmother's confidence disappeared the moment authorities confronted her with the recordings. The calm smile she had worn since the funeral was replaced by panic as every excuse unraveled under undeniable proof. Financial investigators uncovered hidden accounts, secret transactions, and years of cooperation with several accomplices who had helped conceal the fraudulent property transfers. The wealthy businessman was exposed as well. He had known about the legends surrounding the barn long before appearing at her door. Through confidential business contacts, he had learned that valuable documents were believed to be hidden somewhere on the estate. His generous offer had never been about purchasing an old building. He had hoped to secure the property before its true importance was discovered. One by one, every lie collapsed. The courts restored ownership of the land to its rightful heir. Priceless historical valuables were authenticated, protected, and formally recognized as belonging to the family once again. The stolen legacy that had nearly vanished forever was finally returned. Standing outside the barn, she watched investigators leave as the evening sun settled over the fields. The same place everyone had mocked as worthless had become the foundation of the truth that changed everything. She was no longer the frightened daughter forced from her childhood home with a single suitcase. She stood taller than ever before, carrying not only her father's legacy but also the courage he had quietly prepared her to find. For the first time since his death, she looked across the land without fear, knowing that justice had finally reached the place where it had been waiting all along. The months that followed brought countless offers from investors eager to purchase the estate. Some promised fortunes beyond imagination, while others proposed luxury developments that would erase every trace of the family's past. She listened politely, then declined each one without hesitation. Her father's final wish had never been about wealth. It had always been about preserving the truth. Instead of selling the property, she began restoring the old barn with the same patience and determination that had guided her through every discovery. Skilled craftsmen repaired the weathered beams without erasing their history. The broken windows were replaced, the leaking roof rebuilt, and every worn board was carefully preserved whenever possible. Even the carved initials remained untouched, honoring the generations whose lives had shaped the place. The hidden chamber beneath the barn was protected and documented, while its historical records and priceless artifacts became the center of a small museum dedicated to the family's remarkable story. One section displayed her father's journal, alongside copies of the evidence that had uncovered decades of deception and restored the family's rightful legacy. Soon, the barn became more than a museum. Its wide doors welcomed school groups, historians, neighbors, and families who gathered for community events, local celebrations, and educational programs. The building that had once echoed with silence now overflowed with laughter, conversation, and hope. People who had pitied her after the reading of the will returned with entirely different expressions. Those who had dismissed the old barn as worthless now admired the courage it had taken to believe in something no one else could see. Standing beneath the restored northern beam, she smiled as sunlight poured through the windows. The forgotten barn was no longer the edge of the estate. It had become its heart, just as her father had always intended, ensuring that truth, family, and resilience would outlive every lie ever told against them. Years later, visitors often asked her what the greatest discovery beneath the old barn had been. They expected her to mention the priceless artifacts, the restored land, or the documents that had transformed her family's future. She always smiled before giving the same answer. None of those things had been the greatest treasure. The true gift her father left behind could never be measured in acres, wealth, or history. It was his unwavering faith that one day she would have the courage to uncover the truth for herself. He had trusted her when no one else did. He had accepted the pain of being misunderstood so she could inherit something far greater than money alone, a future built on wisdom, resilience, and love. Looking back, she realized every hardship had carried her toward the life he had carefully prepared. The lonely nights, the broken roof, the cruel laughter, and the impossible choices had all shaped the strength she never knew she possessed. As the evening sun settled across the restored estate, she walked once more toward the barn. It was the very same path she had taken after losing everything. Only this time there was no suitcase in her hand. No fear in her heart. The doors opened to warm light, welcoming voices, and the living legacy her father had protected through sacrifice and patience. Children laughed where silence had once lingered, and hope filled every corner that had once held only dust and sorrow. She paused beneath the old northern beam, grateful for the man who had seen her future long before she could see it herself. What had been buried beneath the weathered wood was never just a hidden secret. It was the destiny her father believed she would one day be strong enough to claim.